apprentices to not only not hate their enemies, but to love them. And I went as far as to say to bless them and to pray for them. So first off, when you think, like, why would he say to them, tell them to pray for their enemies? Well, at one level, it is an act of love to go before the source of ultimate goodness and to ask for that on behalf of this person who hurt you is a pretty concrete form of loving. But it also might be a discipline, that is to say, an action that you perform in order to do what you couldn't do by direct effort alone. So why could it be that way? Well, when people pray, it activates the prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex. Both of those areas are needed for forgiveness and emotions of forgiveness, such as empathy and compassion. And the other thing is that memories can be reformed. And so we kind of think of memories as being a very solid object, but they're reconfigured every time. And so if we can bring in these emotions of compassion into the painful memory, we can kind of reform it across time. And so what is forgiveness? Well, we could think of forgiveness as an act of love towards the person that hurt us, that is within our mind, so how we think and feel, and within the world, so how we act. And so Worthington breaks it down into two main categories, being decisional forgiveness, so I'm going to decide not to hurt them and to act rightly towards them, and emotional forgiveness, which is how you learn to feel about them. And so there's actually been well over 2,500 studies suggesting a range of benefits for forgiveness, such as lowered anger, lowered anxiety and depression, increased hope, and closeness to others. And so prayer. What is prayer? Well, a lot of people will break prayer down into several different categories. You might think of colloquial prayer would be like I'm talking to God. And then we could think of like a ritual prayer, something like you're reading from a prayer book, or like the Book of Common Prayer, or like the Psalms or something. And then there's also petitionary prayer, which in psychology tends to get narrowed down to asking for like specific things, like God help me let me have the money to pay for my mortgage or something. And then finally to meditative prayer, which some would define as the experience of God. As you might notice, these definitions overlap a lot, because it's really easy to imagine someone colloquially praying and also having an experience of God, or ritually praying while experiencing a closeness to God. That's a petitionary ritual prayer. And so it gets really hard to distinguish all of these. And so some would suggest that prayer is more about an interaction with God, a conscious choice to involve oneself with God. And then others have suggested that if you're leading someone in prayer for a study, that you would have them just do whatever type of prayer they're comfortable with, and that would help you avoid having to deal with all this weird ambiguity. Or Sarita does that. So with the literature, there's been several interesting studies on how prayer affects forgiveness. So first, there's been several studies that have done a 3-minute prayer. So they would take a group of people and have one group of people pray for someone for 3 minutes, someone that had hurt them, and pray for 3 minutes, and the other group to think of the person's positive attributes, for example, or to do nothing, or just some other condition that they'd set up. And that prayer tends to increase forgiveness. And then there's been another study that was a 16-day-long study. And so they had three groups. They had a forgiveness group, a general prayer group, and a no-contact control group. And so across the two prayer groups, they both increased forgiveness. But the forgiveness prayer group increased empathy. And the reason that's important for this study is that this study is about emotional forgiveness, and empathy is a key component of emotional forgiveness. So for the research question, does praying for a perpetrator increase the victim's sense of emotional forgiveness? Hypothesis 1 is that praying for the perpetrator will increase the victim's sense of emotional forgiveness. Hypothesis 2, that prayer in general will increase the victim's sense of emotional forgiveness. And that hypothesis 3, that prayer in general will not increase emotional forgiveness as much as the forgiveness prayer group. For the methods, so for the participants, they're selected through emails, chapel slides, and posters and the like. Participants required to be current SBU undergraduate students who are 18 years old or older. And for the demographics, who completed the study, 12 were women, 6 were men. All of them were Caucasian. 12 were Protestant/evangelicals, 3 were unaffiliated Christians, 2 were Catholic, and 1 did not choose to answer. So when they had a 5-day window to complete the initial survey, and at the end of the initial survey, they were put into one of these 3 groups. So the forgiveness group, they were to pray for the person that hurt them, that they identified in the study, for 3 minutes each day for the next 4 weeks, and that had 5 participants. And in the general prayer group, they would pray for 3 minutes on a topic they chose for 3 minutes a day for the next 4 weeks. And then the normal prayer group, or the control group, they were to continue whatever their normal prayer routine. We ended up with 7. And so at the end of that 4 weeks, they were given a final survey with a 5-day window to complete it. So for the measures of the study, we had a measure of emotional forgiveness. We had the petition and compassionate petition subscales of the structure of prayer scale, the presence of God subscale from the God image scale, and general demographic questions. These all had a Cronbach's alpha scales between 0.7 and 0.9. And so for examples of these, for emotional forgiveness, it was a 5-point Likert scale. And it would be questions like, I feel compassion towards the person that hurt me. For this, it was, for the petition scale, it was on a 4-point Likert scale, and it was questions like, I must admit that I often ask for material possessions for myself. And the compassionate petition, on the other hand, was things like, when I feel unable to help someone, I often ask God to help them. And then the presence of God subscale would be things like, sometimes when I pray, I feel like cradled by God. And so we did a paired samples t-test across all of these studies. So the total levels of emotional forgiveness across all 3 groups across time went up by a mean of 0.34. And then the total closeness to God across all 3 groups went down by a mean of negative 0.41. And with the t-test, there were no significant differences on the 2 petition scales. And so we conducted an ANOVA's test on the final survey and found that the mean of the compassionate petition scores showed a significant difference. So a post hoc paired comparisons with Bonferroni adjustment revealed a significant difference between the forgiveness group and the normal prayer group, and between the general prayer group and the normal prayer group. And here are the specific numbers if you're interested. And when we performed the ANOVA tests on the petition and closeness to God and emotional forgiveness scales, they came out to be non-significant. So first, while we were unable to support any of the hypotheses, we did find some interesting results. First, that there's greater emotional forgiveness across all 3 groups. So why could that be? It could be that time might have a sort of healing effect, that when someone's hurt, they're probably not as upset 4 weeks later. And that they also may have had more time to heal. It also could be that there was a sort of association drawn between prayer and forgiveness when we had them fill out the study, that they were filling out prayer questions and forgiveness questions toward a specific, about a person. And that could have made some sort of connection in their mind. And then the closeness to God across the groups went down. And it could be that this was sort of general busyness of the semester. They maybe have more stress, less time to think about God. And also, along with the busyness, could lead to fewer spiritual practices, which might also lead to less closeness to God. So the study had some limitations. First, that most people believe they should pray, which is cool, but it does lead to some interesting problems. First, that the social desirability responding, so like, oh, I think people want me to respond this way, so I'll respond that way. As well as issues of self-deceit. So someone might say, oh, I'm not actually angry at them, I'm just upset. And part of that ties into the fact that when people get angry, the parts of your brain that register whether or not you're angry get sort of deactivated, and so that could lead to more self-deceit with their answers. And then second, we had very few and very homogeneous participants. They were all Caucasians of a similar age, of a similar religious subset, which makes it very hard to generalize to larger population groups. And the next point is that we had a problem with power problem with multivariate ANOVAs. What that means is that when we try to compare groups, so we compared time 1 and time 2, and then across the 3 groups to see what resulted, we were not able to find significant results, in part because we had so few participants that it would be really hard to get significant results because it was spread so thin. And so having more participants may have increased that, made it hard to understand the results we were getting. One might say they're indubitably uninterpretable. And the study was also a very long study, and so having a shorter study may have been able to catch the differences because people may have just healed naturally over that time. And it's hard to say if the prayer could have affected, how that could have affected it. But the study also had some strengths. First, that it had the potential to differentiate between groups, between the prayer groups and between a group that was just doing whatever their normal prayer routine was. Then it was able to assess the spiritual life across time. And it was able to study a seemingly very understudied area of the forgiveness and prayer literature. So how prayer affects forgiveness type of literature is very understudied to begin with, but I was unable to find any studies on how it affected emotional forgiveness. The closest I found were ones on forgiveness, and then the one suggesting the change in emotional forgiveness. And so, in conclusion, the study assessed how prayer affects emotional forgiveness. And while we were unable to support the hypotheses, we did find at least 2 interesting results, namely that forgiveness increased across all groups, forgiveness increased across time, and that across time, the participants grew less close to God. And here are my questions.